At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. Max Jensen's stale synth-bore sandwich was a crime against swine, technology, and the very concept of food. The slab of gray, textured protein tasted of rust and pennies, and it was wedged between two pieces of nutrient gel bread that simulated rye in less than an accurate manner. It was also his only meal for this rotation, so he applied himself to the task of consumption with the grim focus of a man defusing a bomb. He hunched under the stuttering holographic sign of a noodle stall on Elysium Station's sump level, a perpetual chemical drizzle. The station's metallic sweat sizzled on the hot Duracrete, painting the grime in iridescent, toxic sheens. This was his world: busted engines, overdue rent notices from a landlord who resembled a sentient pile of jellied regret, and a sandwich that tasted like a dare. Across the grimy plaza, a cluster of Korathi teenagers, their clothes so clean they seemed to warp the station's filth around them, shared a laugh. Their amusement was directed at a solitary figure huddled in the shadows of an exhaust vent, a person attempting to shrink into non-existence. She was a Korathi girl, severely thin, her aristocratic features smudged with a grime that failed to hide the sharp, elegant lines of her face. Max recognized that specific brand of desperation. This was distinct from the polished misery of a career beggar. This was the panicked, hollow-eyed shock of someone who tumbled from a great height and discovered the ground was much harder than they'd been led to believe. Her digital accounts were likely frozen, her name a beacon for trouble. She was starving, and for her kind, starvation was more than a physical ailment. It was a catastrophic failure of status, a shame so profound it carved a hole in the soul. Max was an engineer, not a knight. His spine was bad and his credit score was worse. But the smug, effortless cruelty of the rich kids chafed at him in a way his landlord's gurgles never could. It was an old familiar friction. With a sigh that fogged in the damp air, he rose, the joints in his knees cracking in protest. He walked over, the teens dissolving like startled birds at the approach of a grubby human. He stopped before the girl. She kept her gaze fixed on the stained pavement. He tore his sad, offensive sandwich in half. "Here," he grunted, shoving the piece toward her. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were a pale, startling violet, and they blazed with a complex fire: fury at his pity, shame at her predicament, and a raw self-loathing that was painful to witness. Accepting charity meant admitting utter defeat. A low growl rumbled in her throat, a sound more animal than person. She snatched the food from his hand like a cornered predator, her fingers brushing his. Her touch was cold. She offered no thanks. She turned her back to him, hunching over the sandwich and devouring it with a ferocity that contradicted her frail appearance. Max shrugged, a gesture that encompassed the universe's general state as a dumpster fire. He walked away, turning his collar up against the drizzle. As he departed, the girl's violet eyes locked onto the faded, grease-stained logo on the back of his jacket. A gear and a wrench crossed like a skull and bones, with the words "Jensen's Ship Repair" printed in appealing, once bold font. Human outfits were notoriously unaffiliated, operating in the cracks of syndicate law. A long shot, but the only one she had. He forgot her face almost instantly. She, however, burned his emblem into her memory. A week later, Max was shoulder-deep in the guts of a freighter's atmospheric sensor, cursing it in 3 languages, 2 of them human. The diagnostic panel flashed a code that, loosely translated, meant the machine suffered from acute existential dread. "I feel you, pal," he muttered, giving a capacitor a frustrated flick. "But I've got a landlord shaped like a sentient pile of gelatinous regret, and he wants his rent." The workshop's heavy blast door blew inward with a deafening shriek of tortured metal. It crumpled like a kicked-in ration can, vomiting a shower of sparks and hot slag across the concrete floor. The sudden violence left a ringing in Mac's ears. Standing in the smoking, jagged maw of the doorway was the girl from the market. She was no longer just thin, she was haggard, a wild, hunted look in her eyes that spoke of days spent running and nights without sleep. One hand was clamped tight to her side, dark fluid seeping between her fingers. In the other, she clutched a sleek silver data drive. Between her, the rhythmic, disciplined thud of armored boots echoed down the corridor. They were close. She found him. This was no accident. "You," she hissed, her voice a ragged gasp that was more air than sound. "Seal the door." For half a second, Max just stared. The part of his brain responsible for self-preservation screamed at him to throw her back into the hall. But the part that made him share his sandwich, the stupid, stubborn, bleeding heart part he usually kept heavily sedated, took over. He lunged for the wall panel, his hand slamming down on the emergency override. With a groan of protesting gears, a secondary Durasteel security door crashed down, its impact shaking the whole workshop. The pounding of the armored boots was replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of something dense hitting the new door. They bought themselves moments. The girl, Quilla, though he didn't know her name yet, stumbled forward and collapsed against a workbench, scattering tools across the floor. Her breathing was a shallow, painful rasp. "It's not closing," she gritted out, the admission of weakness costing her more than the physical pain. With a shuddering breath, she tore open the side of her tunic. The wound was brutal. A plasma bolt had carved a deep, blackened furrow along her ribs. The edges were seared and glossy, but the center had torn open again, bleeding a sluggish, dark fluid. Max said nothing. He grabbed his industrial medical cauterizer from its hook on the wall, a tool he normally used for micro-welding delicate ship components. It hummed to life, the tip glowing a malevolent orange. "This is gonna suck," he said, his voice devoid of pity or bedside manner. It was a practical assessment, a mechanic diagnosing a problem. That bluntness was, in its own strange way, a mercy. He wasn't judging her weakness, he was preparing to fix the damage. She glared up at him, her violet eyes challenging him, daring him to see her flinch. He knelt beside her, the heat from the tool washing over her skin. He pressed the glowing tip to the wound. The smell of superheated plastisteel and cooked meat filled the small space, sharp and acrid. A sharp, strangled cry was torn from her throat, but she swallowed the scream. Her jaw clenched so tight he could see the muscles straining. Her free hand shot out and gripped his shoulder, her nails digging into the fabric of his jacket like claws. Their faces were inches apart. He saw the faint flicker of the orange-hot tool reflected in her wide, pained eyes and felt the tremor in her hand clamped on his shoulder. There was only the smell of burning, the low hum of the tool, and the ragged sound of her breathing in the sudden, terrible quiet of the workshop. The pounding on the Durasteel door intensified, each impact leaving a shallow dent in the metal. It wouldn't hold forever. "Get me to my ship," Quilla snarled through clenched teeth, the words tight with pain and urgency. Her grip on his shoulder was iron. "Docking Bay 9C." She fumbled in a hidden pocket of her torn tunic and pulled out a heavy physical credit chit. It was old tech, untraceable, and looked like it was worth a fortune. 5 million credits, she gasped, shoving it into his hand. "It's yours. That's half the bounty on my head." The weight of the chit was nothing compared to the weight of the number. 5 million. That wasn't rent money. That was get a better sandwich money. That was get off this station and never look back money. It was also every bounty hunter from here to the core worlds will be on your ass money. "My workshop security is meant to keep out junkies, not syndicate assassins," he said dryly, his mind already racing. "But I know a shortcut." "Then find another way." "Already on it." Before she could protest, he grabbed a heavy wrench and slammed it against a specific section of the floor. With a clang, he pried open a large, rusted grate. A gust of damp, filtered air wafted up from the darkness below. It was the station's labyrinthine maintenance tunnels, a network of conduits, crawl spaces, and service corridors so old and poorly documented that even the station authorities avoided them. For Max, it was a second home. He helped her to her feet, her arm slung over his shoulder. She was light, but leaned on him with a surprising strength. They descended into the darkness just as the Durasteel door finally gave way with a deafening groan, buckling inward under the force of a plasma charge. They half ran, half stumbled through the grimy tunnels, the only light coming from Max's wrist-mounted work lamp. The air was thick with the scent of hot metal, lubricant, and decay. Twice, they had to press themselves into alcoves as maintenance drones rumbled past, their optical sensors sweeping the darkness. Quilla was silent, her focus entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, her pride the only thing holding her together. They emerged behind a stack of cargo containers in Docking Bay 9C, and there it was, her ship, the Nightfall Razor. It was a sleek, predatory thing. an experimental Karathi scout fighter with lines that were both elegant and brutally efficient. Even with a scorched hull and a cracked canopy, it was a work of art. As Quilla keyed in the access code, her movements focused and alert despite the pain. The cockpit door hissed open. "Get in," she ordered, sliding into the co-pilot's seat. "You're flying." "It's your ship, and you're the one who knows how to fly ugly. I saw the way you were looking at those cargo cranes on the way here. Now go!" He didn't argue. He strapped himself into the pilot's seat, his right hand flicking a sequence of switches while his left calibrated the nav screen. A throttle was a throttle, a yoke was a yoke, the rest was just details. The engines whined to life with a sound like a panther's scream. As they blasted out of the docking bay, alarms blared across the station. 2 Karathi Syndicate gunships, black and angular like fragments of scattered night, detached from the station's superstructure and fell in behind them, plasma cannons already glowing. A thrilling, terrifying chase erupted through the chaotic space lanes of Elysium. Weaving through lumbering cargo haulers and dodging, darting commuter pods, Max pushed the Razor to its limits. The gunships were faster, their pilots clearly military trained, their movements coordinated and deadly. They were boxing him in. Seeing no way out, Max's mind did what it always did with a broken system. It found the flaw, the stress point, the one piece you could misuse to make the whole thing work differently. He saw one of the station's massive magnetic cargo cranes swinging a multi-ton container of raw ore into position. To the Syndicate pilots, it was an obstacle. To Max, it was a component. "Hang on," he yelled. "This is going to get stupid." He drove the Razor directly at the crane. Quilla let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. The gunships followed, anticipating his move, ready to corner him against the station's hull, but he wasn't trying to go around it. He fired the ship's ventral grav plates, creating a microgravity well that locked them to the container's hull for a fraction of a second. The Karathi gunship pilots hesitated, their rigid tactical minds unable to process the sheer lunacy of the maneuver. That hesitation was all Max needed. As the crane arm reached the apex of its arc, he cut the plates. They were flung, a stone from a slingshot, a metal bullet fired from a cannon made of junk. The G-force was immense, slamming them back into their seats, threatening to black them out. Alarms screamed inside the cockpit as the ship's frame groaned under the strain, but it worked. They rocketed past their pursuers, a blur of motion that left the disciplined Karathi pilots staring at empty space. Max grinned, a wild, fierce thing. "See? Stupid." He slammed the jump drive activation sequence, and the stars outside blurred into streaks of strange light. The Nightfall Razor was their prison and their sanctuary, a tiny bubble of breathable air hurtling through the unreal chaos of jump space. They were safe for now. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a raw, vibrating awareness of each other in the confined space. They immediately started arguing. "You're a barbarian!" Quilla shouted, her voice shaking with a mixture of residual fear and pure fury. She'd unstrapped herself and stood over him, her hands on her hips. "A reckless, unrefined savage! You could have torn the ship apart! You could have killed us!" "Yeah, well, almost killed is a hell of a lot better than definitely killed, which is where your friends back there were headed," he shot back, leaning back in the pilot's seat. "Besides, your ship held together. Good engineering. Little janky on the internal dampeners, though. My teeth are still vibrating." That was the wrong thing to say. Her eyes narrowed. To be praised for her ship's engineering by a human grease monkey who just used it like a battering ram was the ultimate insult. She needed to reassert control, to remind him of the hierarchy. She moved with a speed that shocked him. Before he could react, she had him pinned against the cockpit wall, one forearm pressed against his throat. Karathi physiology, honed for a slightly higher gravity, gave her a wiry, deceptive strength. "Do not mock my ship, human," she snarled, her face inches from his. "And do not mock me." He didn't try to match her muscle. That would be a losing game of attrition. Instead, with a mechanic's brutal practicality, he did something no trained Karathi warrior would ever anticipate. He stomped, hard, on the instep of her boot. It was a simple, dirty playground move, and it worked perfectly. She cried out, a sharp hiss of pain, and her balance faltered for a critical second. He used the moment not to push her away, but to move with her. He twisted, using a kind of leverage he learned from wrestling heavy engine blocks into place, and reversed their positions in a single fluid motion. Now she was the one pinned against the wall, his body trapping hers, his hand resting lightly on the bulkhead next to her head. A slow, cocky smirk played on his lips. "Guess you're not used to a human fighting dirty," he said, his voice a low rumble. Her violet eyes were wide with surprise, her breath catching in her throat. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with a grudging, infuriated respect. She glared at him for a long moment, then shoved him back, creating a sliver of space between them. "Don't touch me again," she ordered, her voice cold but lacking its earlier fire. She retreated to the co-pilot's chair, the argument over, but the power dynamic between them permanently, irrevocably altered. After hours of tense silence, each of them locked in their own thoughts in the cramped cockpit, Quilla finally broke. She watched him, watched the way his hands moved over the controls, the way his mind worked, not in straight lines but in chaotic, brilliant loops. She came to him for a disposable tool, a pilot. She realized she might need a partner. She pulled the sleek sliver data drive from her tunic. It felt heavy in her hand, heavier than it should. "The mission I told you about? Getting me to a safe house?" she began, her voice quiet, formal. "It was a lie." Max turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "The 5 million credits are real," she continued, "but their purpose was a simple drop-off. This is the real prize." She slotted the drive into the ship's navigation console. A holographic star chart loomed in the space between them. A three-dimensional map of a desolate, forgotten sector. A single point glowed ominously within a dense asteroid field. A stellar graveyard. "It's the coordinates to the Vault of Nightfall," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a lifetime of resentment. "My father's secret armory. A ghost fleet. A cache of weapons from the old wars. Weapons that can break worlds. He keeps them as a threat, a promise of what he can do if his rivals push him too far." Max stared at the glowing map, then at her. "So what's the plan? You planning on taking over the family business?" A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "My plan is to destroy it, to erase it, so that no one, not my father, not his enemies, can ever use it." The news of the lie stole the air from his lungs. The deck seemed to tilt beneath his feet. He wasn't just a pilot, he was ammunition. She looked him in the eye and lied, dragging him into the middle of a private war that could ignite a galactic conflict, all without his consent. "You piece of work," he said softly, the words sharp as broken glass. "You were going to get me killed over a family feud." Before the argument could escalate, a new alarm blared from the console. A shrill, insistent warning, a diagnostic overlay flashed across the star chart. The slingshot maneuver did more damage than he'd thought. The primary fuel cell was leaking, and the portside hull integrity was dropping into the red. They were running on fumes and held together with mutual distrust. Quilla's data drive, a repository of syndicate secrets, held more than just doomsday weapon locations. It held the locations of black markets, private havens, and other unsavory places where one could get repairs and fuel with no questions asked. The closest one was a notorious pirate haven carved into a hollowed-out asteroid, the Crimson Nebula Bazaar. The bazaar was a sensory overload. Holographic signs in a dozen languages flickered and fought for attention, advertising everything from illegal cybernetics to contraband weapons and questionable food stalls. The air was a thick soup of exotic spices, engine exhaust, and unwashed bodies. Posing as mercenaries with a damaged ship and a need to be discreet, they found a secluded docking bay run by a corsair captain with articulated spines on his back and a smile that showed too many silver-capped teeth. They found a quiet alcove in the sprawling market to begin work on the ship themselves, using the parts they'd just bought. It was too risky to let the corsair's mechanics get a close look at the Razor's experimental tech. She understood the delicate Karathi systems, the intricate power distribution grid, and the graceful flow of energy through the ship's fibrous, light-conducting cables. He understood the physical reality of it all, how to bypass a fried circuit with a length of copper wire, how to reinforce a stressed frame with scavenged plates, how to convince a dying power converter to give him one last surge. They worked in near silence, a non-verbal communication developing between them, a pointed gesture, a passed tool, a shared nod of understanding when a particularly tricky component finally clicked into place. Over the shared language of keeping their vessel, their only home, their only chance of survival, alive, something new was being built between them, a partnership. Their deal for the fuel cells with the spined Corsair captain, a brute named Skeg, went sideways. He'd seen the Razor up close, recognized its value, and decided he wanted to add it to his collection. "The price has changed," Skeg rumbled, blocking their exit from the cargo bay, his 10 goons fanning out behind him, brandishing plasma cutters and heavy-duty stun batons. "The ship, for your lives." Quilla didn't hesitate. A razor-thin blade, almost invisible until it caught the light, hissed from a hidden sheath on her wrist. She moved like a dancer, a deadly, elegant whirlwind of motion, her blade flashing as she engaged the pirates. She was graceful and beautiful in her brutality. Max was not. He spotted his salvation in the corner of the bay, a hulking, four-armed cargo loader mech, its yellow paint chipped and stained with hydraulic fluid. As Quilla's dance bought him a precious few seconds, he made a mad sprint for it, leaping into the open cockpit cage. The controls were a nightmare of alien levers and touchpads designed for 4 hands. He had no time to learn. His mind, however, saw it not as a vehicle to be piloted, but as a machine to be hot-wired. He ripped open a control panel, his eyes tracing the power lines. With a mechanic's instinct, he bypassed the complex operating system and directly fused the primary motor function circuits. He wasn't piloting the mech, he was hijacking its nervous system. The machine roared to life. He used it not as a tool, but as a clumsy, brutal suit of power armor, a 10-ton extension of his own body. He didn't know how to work the delicate pincer claws, so he just used the massive arms as battering rams. He smashed through pirates and shipping containers with sheer, unrefined force, his internal monologue a frantic stream of curses and prayers. "Okay, this lever probably does something big. Let's find out." A pirate lunged at Quilla's back. Max swung one of the mech's huge arms, catching the goon and sending him flying into a stack of crates with a satisfying crunch. Quilla glanced over, her eyes wide with a flicker of disbelief and something that might have been grudging admiration. They won. Max brought the mech's massive fist down on the last conscious pirate, and the cargo bay fell silent, save for the hum of the damaged mech and the crackle of a few small fires. They had to get out. He drove the mech straight through a secondary wall, crashing into a dark, silent storage hold beyond. He killed the power, and the mech slumped, suddenly inert. He scrambled out of the cockpit, his knuckles bleeding, his whole body buzzing. They were both bruised, battered, and soaring on the violent high of victory. They turned to each other in the gloom, silhouettes against the orange glow of the fires in the next bay. The explosive tension that had been building since the workshop, since the cockpit, finally shattered. He grabbed her, she grabbed him, and they crashed together in a rough, desperate, searingly hot kiss. It was an expression of survival. It was the raw, unspoken acknowledgement that they had just saved each other's lives. It was adrenaline and desperation and the animal need to feel something other than pain and fear. His hand tangled in her hair, her fingers dug into his jacket, and in the darkness of the pirate-infested asteroid, surrounded by fire and wreckage, it was messy, violent, and perfect. In the quiet of their repaired ship, hurtling through the silent gulf between stars, the adrenaline faded. It left behind a raw, emotional vulnerability that was more dangerous than any pirate. The mood, once charged with violent energy, was now heavy with unspoken things. Still reeling from the kiss, from the sheer reality of it, Max finally confronted her. He needed to understand. He needed the truth to be a solid thing he could hold on to. "You lied to me," he said, his voice flat. He wasn't angry anymore. He was something colder, sharper. "This was a small omission, Quilla. You weren't just hiring a taxi, were you? You were looking for a disposable soldier. You were going to point me at a ghost fleet, full of apocalyptic weapons, and hope I didn't get vaporized in the process." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any signs of remorse. "After I saved your ass, after I patched you up, you were still going to use me and throw me away." The hurt was plain on his face, a raw, open wound. He didn't just get angry, he got analytical, connecting the dots with the mechanic's cold logic. He paced the small confines of the cockpit, the motion agitated, restless. "It doesn't add up," he said, more to himself than to her. "You're Korathi royalty, the daughter of a kingpin surrounded by more wealth than I'll see in 10 lifetimes. Your family controls entire star systems, and a week ago you were starving in an alley, hiding from your own people, ready to kill for half a stale sandwich." He stopped and turned to face her, his gaze intense. Doesn't that tell you something? Doesn't that tell you your whole world is broken?" His words hit her harder than any plasma bolt. No one had ever dared speak to her like that. No one had ever questioned the fundamental structure of her existence. He pressed on, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I get it. My gear breaks, I fix it. That's my life. My ship, my tools, my workshop. If it's busted, I make it work again. Your people break, and you throw them away in an alley to starve." He jabbed a finger in her direction, the accusation stark and undeniable. "You were going to do the same thing to me." That was the line, the one that connected his blue-collar reality directly to her aristocratic hypocrisy. She wasn't just a princess on a mission, she was a part of a broken system that had discarded her, and in her desperation, she had been ready to do the same to him. For the first time, she saw the rot in her gilded cage not as an inconvenience to be escaped, but as a fundamental corrupting flaw. She saw the rot through his eyes. The confrontation shattered the last of her pride. The carefully constructed walls of her arrogance and discipline she had spent her entire life building came crumbling down. Tears, hot and shameful, welled in her eyes. She hated them, hated the weakness they represented. But in the quiet confines of the Nightfall Razor, with only his blunt, stubborn human as a witness, she finally let her guard down. She told him everything about her cold, pragmatic father, Lord Soren Vale, who saw her as a political asset, about the arranged marriage to Lord Zareb, a cruel, ambitious rival she despised, a union designed to keep a fragile peace within the syndicate. She spoke of a life with no real choices, a beautiful cage where every move was dictated by tradition and power. He listened. He didn't offer pity or platitudes, he just listened. And when she was done, her voice a raw whisper in the silent ship, he shared a small piece of his own lonely existence. He told her about growing up in the orphanages of Elysium Sump, about learning to fix things because it was the only way to make himself useful, the only way to have something that was truly his. He told her about the quiet, gnawing loneliness of being a second-class citizen in a galaxy that saw him as little more than a strong back and a pair of hands. The emotional walls between them didn't just crumble, they evaporated. Later, in the small, quiet cabin of the Nightfall Razor, their only safe space in the universe, they came together again. This time, it was a conscious, deliberate choice. It was slow, tender, a silent exploration of scars both visible and hidden. It was an affirmation, a passionate act between two equals who had found an unlikely solace and a sense of home in each other. A silent promise whispered in the dark to protect the fragile thing they had built within the ship's hull. They arrived at the coordinates. The Vault of Nightfall was a ship, a colossal derelict Korathi dreadnought from a forgotten war. The IVS Star Ender, adrift in a stellar graveyard choked with the silent, shattered remains of other vessels. The location's derelict nature was its camouflage. Scans showed nothing but dead metal and faint radiation signatures. The dreadnought itself was hidden deep inside the hollowed-out husk of an even larger, more ancient alien vessel, making it invisible to all but the most specific scans. As the Nightfall Razor drifted closer, the ghost ship awakened. Panels slid open on the pockmarked hull, revealing automated plasma turrets that swiveled to track them. A cold, synthesized voice crackled over their comms. "Unidentified vessel, you have entered a restricted Korathi heritage zone. State your purpose or be sanitized." Sanitized. Charming, Max muttered. "This is the janitor AI my father installed," Quilla explained. "It's ancient, malevolent, and single-minded. Its only purpose is to keep people out." Getting inside was a harrowing ordeal. Max flew the Razor through the debris field, using asteroids and the skeletal remains of old cruisers as cover, dodging bolts of white-hot plasma. At the main hangar bay, the doors were sealed by centuries of neglect and a security procedure that was a knot of archaic Korathi encryption. "I can't break it from here," Quilla said, her fingers tracing glowing circuit paths on a console. "It's a physical system." "Right, the old-fashioned way it is." Max donned a light EVA suit. "Just keep its attention." He spacewalked over to the hangar control panel, his mag boots clamped to the hull. While Quilla led the turrets on a merry chase, he pried open the panel and went to work, bypassing centuries-old circuits with a roll of copper wire and a healthy dose of pure ingenuity. The doors groaned open just as a plasma bolt grazed the Razor's wing. Inside, the dreadnought was a labyrinth of echoing corridors and eerie silence. Gravity plates flickered on and off, creating disorienting shifts in weight. Dormant, spider-like combat drones, covered in the dust of ages, stirred in their alcoves as they passed, their single red optical sensors glowing to life. They were forced to fight their way through, Quilla's blade a silver blur and Max's plasma pistol barking in the tight confines. They finally reached the central vault, a cavernous chamber at the heart of the ship. Racks of sleeping doomsday weapons lined the walls. Planet killers, fleet breakers, genetic plagues. It was a museum of horrors. As Quilla accessed the main console, preparing to overload the dreadnought's primary power core, the proximity alarms on the Razor screamed a warning. A fleet of pristine Karathi Syndicate warships dropped out of FTL, their forms sleek and predatory against the backdrop of the stellar graveyard. They surrounded the derelict. Lord Zareb had found them. An epic, chaotic space battle erupted. While Quilla worked frantically at the console, Max sprinted back toward the hangar, patching into the Razor systems. He couldn't pilot it directly, but he could do the next best thing. He slaved the ship's basic flight and weapons controls to his wristcom, a messy, jury-rigged interface that would have given a Karathi engineer a seizure. The tiny fighter shot out of the hangar, Max controlling it from afar, a half-second of lag between his commands and the ship's response. The Razor was immediately caught between Zareb's warships. It was a brawler's tactic against a fencer's, raw ingenuity against rigid doctrine. Max used the debris field as both weapon and shield. He flew with a terrifying, unpredictable abandon that no Karathi tactical computer could model. He scraped the Razor past the hulls of dead giants to use them as cover. He vented plasma into the unstable power core of a derelict cruiser to trigger a chain reaction, creating an impromptu minefield that vaporized two of Zareb's escorts. It was pure human chaos, pitted against disciplined, rigid Karathi military tactics, and the chaos was winning. Enraged, his strategy failing, Zareb made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He decided to handle it himself. A boarding craft detached from his flagship and slammed into the Star Ender's hull. He confronted them in the vault, flanked by his elite cybernetically augmented guard. Zareb was a nightmare of polished chrome and aristocratic contempt. He moved with a speed that was not quite natural, his augmentations a blur of motion. "My dear Quilla," he purred, his voice a silken, condescending caress. "Running away with the hired help? So terribly common. I had hoped for more from my future bride." He disarmed Quilla with contemptuous ease, his augmented hands snapping out and sending her blade clattering across the deck. He backhanded her, a casual display of ownership that sent a jolt of pure rage through Max. "I will enjoy dissecting this human pet of yours," Zareb sneered, turning his attention to Max. "I want to see what makes such a creature tick." But he fundamentally misunderstood human desperation. He saw Max as an insect and annoyance. He didn't see the cornered rat ready to chew through steel to survive. As Zareb advanced, Max didn't draw his weapon. He grabbed the nearest object, a portable fire suppression canister from the wall. He blasted a thick cloud of icy coolant gas directly into Zareb's face. Zareb's advanced optical sensors, designed to see across the electromagnetic spectrum, were instantly and totally blinded by the sudden extreme temperature shift. Zareb stumbled back, roaring in fury and confusion. In that moment of blindness, Max charged. He didn't try to punch him, didn't try to win a fight he knew he couldn't. He tackled him, his only goal to get close. As they crashed to the floor, Max's hand shot out, ripping a live plasma grenade from Zareb's own utility belt. He armed it, shoved it deep into a small, unshielded maintenance joint where Zareb's augmented spine met his torso, and then kicked off with all of his strength, scrambling backward just as it detonated. The explosion was contained but devastating. Zareb and his guards were vaporized in a silent, brilliant flash of blue-white light. Without a word, Quilla ran back to the master console, her face set. "Core overload initiated. We have 90 seconds." The janitor AI screamed over the ship's internal comms, a digital shriek of agony and outrage as the whole vessel began to tear itself apart. They sprinted back the way they came, dodging collapsing corridors, exploding consoles, and the death throes of the ancient dreadnought. They barely made it, leaping into the cockpit of the Nightfall Razor, just as the hangar bay's magnetic containment failed. Max gunned the engines, and they blasted clear of the Star Ender an instant before its core went critical. The vault of Nightfall exploded. The derelict dreadnought became a miniature sun, a silent, brilliant flash that incinerated the rest of Zareb's fleet and lit up the graveyard with the fire of a newborn star. Quilla's past, her cage, her future, it was all erased in that clean, purifying fire. Bruised, battered, running on fumes, and still spectacularly broke, they were back on Elysium Station. They sat on the exact same bench by the noodle stall where it had all begun. The chemical drizzle still fell, the holographic signs still flickered, but the world felt different, quieter. The chaos was over. A quiet, anonymous, encrypted message found its way to Quilla's datapad a day earlier. Their bounties had been scrubbed from all official and unofficial networks. Zareb's death and the destruction of the vault, while a blow to the Syndicate, had inadvertently eliminated Lord Soren Vale's most aggressive rival, consolidating his power. The message was a cold political thank you from a father who could never publicly acknowledge his renegade daughter's actions. Their peace was a fragile thing, born of political convenience, but for now, it was real. This time it was Quilla who returned from the stall, holding a steaming bowl of real, non-synthetic noodles. The smell was rich and savory. She sat down next to Max and wordlessly handed him the bowl. He looked at the noodles, then at her. A slow, cocky grin spread across his face as he took it. He saw her smirk back, a genuine, unforced warmth finally reaching her pale, violet eyes. A warmth he now knew was just for him. "Careful, Max Jensen," she said, her voice a low murmur that got lost in the hiss of the rain, but was perfectly clear to him. "Share your food with me again and I might just change your life forever." He took a bite of the noodles. They were the best thing he had ever tasted. Almost good enough to make him forget he still owed 2 months' rent to a sentient jello mold. "Pretty sure you already did," he said, and in the neon-soaked grime of the sump, under a sky he couldn't see, he felt for the first time in a very long time like he was home.